Welcome to Follow Your Curiosity. Ordinary people, extraordinary creativity. Here's how to get unstuck. I'm your host, creativity coach Nancy Norbeck. Let's go. My guest this week is Rob Schwartz, journalist, music and film producer, entrepreneur, and son of the late Morrie Schwartz of Tuesdays with Morrie fame. Rob has founded a number of companies both in Japan and the US and has produced numerous film and music projects with international teams. Rob and I talk about his experiences in Japan and India and how travel enhances creativity and the role of listening in language learning and the influence of language on thinking and behavior. Rob also tells me about The Wisdom of Morrie, his father's last book, which encourages readers to challenge stereotypes and find fulfillment in later stages of life. I think you'll enjoy my wide-ranging conversation with Rob Schwartz. Rob, welcome to Follow Your Curiosity.
Thank you so much. Really happy to be here.
So I start everybody off with the same question. Were you a creative kid or did you discover your creative side later on?
I would say that I was a creative kid. I mean, I didn't pursue anything in particular, but I think I had that kind of mindset from early on, thinking about things in a creative way. I never sort of like fit into the mold of a normal kid, I would say.
So how did that manifest for you, do you think?
You mean in later life or as a child?
When you were a kid. And did your family encourage you or were they kind of indifferent or did
No, they were very encouraging. I think that with me, it was reasonably abstract. So I read a lot and I had a lot of ideas about, maybe abstract or intellectual things. Actually, both my parents are kind of academics, intellectuals. So they encouraged that kind of thing. And it's really funny because my brother was so 180 degrees the opposite. He's so amazing with his hands, taking things apart, putting them back together, just like an incredible mechanic. Anything to do with your hands. He can cook, and I was always just like head in the clouds, thinking about things abstractly and of course talking about them.
Isn't that interesting how you can grow up in the same house and be so different?
Yes.
Happens so often.
Yeah.
So when did you start to home in on your creative side?
It's a good question. Probably started when I was in college, had a bunch of projects and we were very political. We were very politically motivated, but I also had a bunch of creative projects, but it probably really took off. I moved to Japan right after university. So, that's a whole new world. Everything is different. And I started to do a lot of creative things. I started to write. I became a journalist. I got involved in filmmaking. I got involved in music production.
So how did you end up with the opportunity to move to Japan?
I just wanted to do it. And I worked for a few months, maybe almost close, I guess a year before I moved to save some money. And yeah, I just picked up and moved there. At that time, and I think probably even still today, it was pretty easy to move there and to get sort of a basic job, teaching English or something like that. If you want to build a career, and I did, then it takes more effort. Certainly anybody moving to Japan, I would tell them, be prepared for a long haul. Don't think you're going to go to Japan for a year and really, get a lot accomplished. And also be aware that you're going to have to learn the language. You can't really get by in English doing creative things. So if you're willing to make that commitment, I think it's a great opportunity, and it's pretty relatively easy to do once you decide you want to do it, right? For me, it was just a decision. Okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is the plan. You study about it, you learn about it, you know what you need to do, and then you get there,
So had Japan always been a goal, or is it that you knew you wanted to go somewhere and that just seemed like the right place at the right time?
It's funny because it's sort of like a little from this category, a little from that category. It wasn't always the goal. In fact, it wasn't really even the goal until probably right around the time I was graduating. But I had been in India in my junior year or something like that. And I decided that I wanted to explore Asia more. I studied a lot of I studied philosophy in university, but I studied a lot of Asian philosophy, and I studied Chinese and Japanese history. So I had that background. And then at that time, um, late 80s, early 90s, Japanese economy was really booming. So everything seemed to come together. It made sense to go there. Like these days, maybe not right this second, but a few years ago, people would go to China because the economy was booming and stuff. I think politically right now, that's maybe not the best thing. But, so it really shifted away from Japan in the last, let's say, 20 years. But at that time, Japan was really a place that was attractive for a lot of reasons. And it all sort of came together for me.
Well, that's cool. And
yeah.
I mean, both India and Japan, it's an interesting set of contrasts because they're both so different from being here, but they're also so different from each other.
Yes. I could talk about that for a long time if you're interested. I mean, I'm not sure how much your listeners know, so just very briefly, I mean, India is very chaotic, right? It is a huge mix of cultures, of their own cultures, because basically in India, each state has its own culture and its own language. There's like 30 or 40 major languages in India, and it's very chaotic. And of course, it's also a lot of different religions and people very attached to their religions, very, observant. And Japan is pretty much the opposite. It's very, very organized, and religion, not that it doesn't exist, but is very much in the background. People are very focused on work and society. This may not be so different between India and Japan, a little bit different, but Japan is always thought of as this group society where people are so concerned about the group and they sublimate their individual interests. That's really true. And I could talk about that for a long time. In India, much less so. Indians are more individualistic than Japanese, closer to us, let's say. But also the social pressures in India are intense. So that's the flip side of that. Very, very intense. And we could talk about that as well if you like. Yeah.
Wow. I have to think, because one of the things that I'm always fascinated by is how travel influences the creative process.
Yes.
And I have to think that both of those must have been eye-opening in a creative respect and must have left a mark on you.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. And I would agree with you 100%. I mean, traveling in any way, even just out of your hometown, is going to, widen your perspective. But going to a different culture is just completely widens your perspective, opens your eyes to see things in a different way. And that's what creativity is about, right? Seeing things in a way that you're not used to seeing it, or that you're not used to be shown it, or that, is different than is the received view, shall we call it, right? That's what creativity is about. So travel is going to give you a whole different perspective on the world and society and yourself. That's the thing. If you read great travel writing, that's the thing they always stress, is that you find out things about yourself by experiencing things that are so different than yourself.
Yeah. So what, if you had to, this feels like such an unfair question because they're both such big experiences, but if you had to, come up with one or two things that, you got out of both of those countries, what would they be likely to be?
Oh, that is a big question. Oh, wow. With Japan, I would say, I mean, in respect to their culture, probably some discipline. I wasn't that disciplined before I went there, and they're an extremely disciplined people and disciplined society. A kind of delicacy. The Japanese treat each other with a kind of delicacy that is unknown in American culture. And, if you're going to participate in their society and speak in their language, which I do, then you're going to have to learn that. If you don't learn that, people are going to think that you're really rude, basically. They have a very polite, delicate way of dealing with each other. Now, it doesn't mean that they're always wonderful to each other. That can be twisted in ways to be, more that we're more familiar with, whatever, condescending or what have you. But on the basis of it, they have a really delicate way of dealing with each other. In India, it's something to do with the overall wonder of the world and some kind of spiritual connection. Even if you don't take on their spiritual connection, you see so much of that around you that I think it's impossible not to take it on and wonder of the world, not only spiritually, but the land is so rich and so diverse. You have desert, you have the Himalaya, which are the highest mountains in the world. You have oceans, you have islands, wonderful rivers, and it's just an incredible country, so diverse, both culturally and geographically. So I think that that's, that kind of spiritual connection and that kind of diversity of experience is what I got from India.
Wow. And I think there's a huge spiritual dimension to creativity too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, but we could talk about this all day. That's the interesting thing, is like some people experience it as spirituality and some people don't. But I think they're talking about the same thing. There's some connection, whether you call it spirit or just to an idea or whatever, however you experience it, it's some kind of connection that's something beyond yourself, right? Even if you don't consider yourself a spiritual person. So then it comes down to language. What words are you using to describe it? But I think the experience is quite similar. So in essence, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it's hard even to come up with the words to describe it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is hard to talk about creativity sometimes. What is at its base? What is creativity, right? It's making something, it's creating, but where does that come from? Where does the idea come from? It's very hard to know.
Right. I mean, those stories about, and I can't remember which composer it was who said it. I want to say it was one of the Italian composers like Vivaldi or Verdi or one of the ones who starts with V, but I could be wrong, that said, I was just taking dictation. Like it didn't come from me. It came from somewhere else and I just wrote it down.
Yeah.
And, I've had a moment or two like that and it's the wildest thing ever. And I don't know how else to describe it.
Right.
And I don't know how to describe it to anyone who's never experienced that. And if you have experienced that, I'm not sure I need to describe it to you.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a weird place.
Yeah. I understand that. I'm not sure that I've ever had that experience directly per se, but I can understand feeling that it's coming from somewhere else or that you are just the vessel that's recording it or what have you.
Yeah. Well, so you went to Japan.
Yes.
Did you know the language when you got there?
I had studied it on a very basic level, so I maybe knew some very basic stuff, but it took a while. It took a while to learn the language, some years. I never studied. I just listened to people and spoke, and then people correct you and you hear them. The key to learning a language, and I'm not sure if this is what your podcast is about, but I can say it briefly, is listening, right? Is opening up your ears, because and maybe we'll get to this later, but I'm really into languages and linguistics, and we can talk about that. And I think there is a big creative aspect to that as well. But learning a new language means, by definition, learning new sounds, learning new words and new sounds. So you need to open up your ears to make those new sounds available to you. So that's the key to at least beginning to learn a language is opening up your ears, listening really carefully to what people are saying, and then trying to imitate them directly, like get it, spot on, not just, close, right?
Yeah. And I think, because you're a musician,
I'm actually not a musician, but that's okay.
Oh, sorry.
I produced music. Music. I ran some record labels, but I would never call myself a musician. No.
Because I've always heard that, if you're musical, it's easier to pick up languages. And I think that's
I think it's true.
why.
Oh, I definitely think it's true, because musicians, hear music in a whole different way than non-musicians. You can hear the tones, you can hear the gradation between the tones, and that's going to help you hear words and pronunciations and stuff for sure. And there is some, without getting too abstract, I think there is some confluence between music and language. Obviously, language is, got more meaning embedded in it. Music is more up to our own interpretation, but they're both systems which are through sound, basically. And yeah, there is a lot of meeting points between the two.
Yeah, and music is one of the few things where you're actually taught to listen. Most
It's a great
of us
thing.
are not taught to listen.
Right. Especially in this society. Our society is about getting your point of view out there and making yourself heard as opposed to listening. And, it sounds kind of trite when you say it now, but you learn a lot more by listening than you do by talking.
You really, really do. It's kind of amazing in a way that shouldn't be. It's sort of embarrassing when you start to realize how much more you learn when you really listen. Right. Because we all think that we listen a lot more than we really do.
Yes.
And then when we notice the difference, you're like, boy, what have I been missing all this time? Because I thought I was paying attention and I thought I was really listening, and I really haven't been.
Right. And I mean, that opens up a whole nother discussion about, even when you do listen, how much do you catch and how much do you retain? Because, there's so much stuff out there, and our brain is going to whittle it down, is going to filter it to just a certain amount of things that we can latch onto. But for sure, listening is absolutely crucial. It's for learning languages, for learning anything, it's crucial. And I mean, I have to say, personally, for one of my the ways that I look at people, when I meet somebody, that's the first thing that I try and observe about them. Are they really listening to me, or are they just waiting for me to finish talking so they can talk,
Right, because that's what most of us do.
Well, I don't want to say most of us, but, there's some people like that.
A lot of us.
Okay. About your superior wisdom.
Well, and in fairness, I don't think we realize that.
Right.
We're focused on what we think we need to respond with. And because we're focused on preparing that next comment, we miss a lot of what the other person's saying, because that's not where our attention is.
Right.
So it's not malicious. It's just kind of where we are.
I think there's 2 or 3 reasons. We could analyze why, what are the reasons for that? And I think there's 2 or 3 reasons. I mean, I think at base, this is certainly American culture. Maybe it's endemic to the world at large now, but people want to get their opinion out there. They want to be heard. They want to feel like, they're whatever, putting it out there or participating or whatever. And, I understand that feeling, but maybe it's a little bit too dominant in our society, that's about ego. That's about, wanting to be whatever important, present, or what have you, and it's maybe a little bit overpowering in our society, the way American culture has developed,
I would agree with that.
Yeah, much less so in Japan. Much less so. Not non-existent, but less so. People are much more, within themselves and participate in the group. And you'll enjoy this. It makes for very interesting discussions because, our discussions are like, you say something and I have to respond exactly to what you said, right? If I start talking about something else, that would be weird in America, right? But in Japan, that often happens. Somebody, you're having a group discussion and somebody will make some comment and everybody, they'll take it in. And the next person start talking, we'll just talk about something completely different. They won't respond directly to that person or feel like it's got to be, a direct. They'll just go off in the direction that they want to. So I'm not saying either way is better. It definitely weird for us as Americans, even as an American who speaks Japanese. But, that's a cultural difference.
Yeah, it's about what you're used to.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So did you ever fully adjust to that? Does it still feel weird if you encounter that kind of?
Okay, so now you're moving into territory, and we can talk about this. We have to talk about the book at some point.
We do. Don't worry.
We'll get there. But now you're getting into really, as I mentioned earlier, my sort of love and things that I'm investigating now. So this will answer the question, where is my curiosity leading me? But language is, how can I express this, is so much defining the way that we think and the way that we react and even what we feel. People who only speak one language think, okay, this is tree stands for this object, and you just put a bunch of those together and that's language. That's so not it at all. Language is a complete worldview. It's a complete value system. I mean, not specific, but general value system, but it's a worldview. It really defines how we see the world. So when I was in Japan and I was speaking Japanese, you're thinking in a whole different way. If you really speak a language, anybody who speaks two languages knows this, you don't translate in your mind. You're just speaking that language. You're thinking in that language. So it's very natural for me to participate in a Japanese discussion the way that I previously outlined and not think like, oh, that's weird that he didn't respond directly to what that other person says, because you're in that Japanese context. You're in that Japanese language, and it's a different world. It's literally a different world. And this part I actually wrote some essays on in Japan. You have a different personality. I mean, not completely different, but significantly different. I have a significantly different personality in Japanese than in English. I'm much more polite. And that
so
sounds funny, but it's true. It's true.
It makes a lot of sense, because you're right that, the language and the culture are so intertwined that the culture informs how you use the language, and that informs how you interact. And so there you are.
That's exactly right. And you have to remember, we're talking a pretty extreme case, right? Japanese language and Japanese culture and English language and American culture are extremely different, right? If you have two languages that are closer, like English and Spanish, then the difference isn't so noticeable. But I think anybody who's truly bilingual would probably tell you something similar, that they maybe have slightly different personality or they see the world a slightly different way. But Japanese and English is so noticeable because they're so different.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I love languages. I mean, we could talk about this for hours. And every language is, has its own way of presenting things. And it's so funny. I have this book that says like 10 myths about language. And there's a couple of them that people just can't believe, but linguists will tell you these really are myths. For example, one language is spoken more quickly than another. That's a myth. All languages are spoken approximately at the same speed. But if you hear a language you don't understand, it sounds like they're talking really quickly. Another one, which I really love, is that some languages are more logical than other languages. It's a complete myth. And how would you even go about establishing that? What language would you analyze that language in? Every language is a closed system. And inside of that language, it's completely logical. French linguists back like 100 years ago were completely convinced that French was the most logical language. But of course, French was their language.
Right.
Obviously, they thought that.
Right. I mean, I took French in middle school and high school, and I took some Latin in college that nearly killed me. And, what nearly killed me with Latin was that not only did you have to learn all of the different verb conjugations, but you essentially had to learn to conjugate nouns because you declined them and all of that. And it was just so stinking much to try to remember.
Yeah.
But if you were an ancient Roman, it made perfect sense because of course it did. You grew up with it. You didn't know anything else.
Right. And but it's not a myth. Sorry to interrupt you. It's not a myth that some languages are more complicated than others. Latin and Russian, like unbelievable grammatical declensions and then we have Indonesian, which doesn't even have a past tense. There's just like, they can still communicate everything that we communicate in the other languages. They just do it in different ways.
Right.
But the grammar is more simple, right?
Right. No. But yeah, I mean, that was not something I was prepared for in Latin, but it had its system. I mean, you could see how it worked, whether or not I could keep track of it in my head was my own personal problem.
Right. For sure.
So yeah, I mean, if you grew up with it, it made perfect sense. And that's also, where you start to learn, Yeah, the Romans have a whole pile of different words for war because the Romans spent a whole heck of a lot of time
Right.
at
Well, there's
war.
that. There's that too, right?
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, but just getting back to grammar for a second, it is true that if it's closer to your language, it seems to be easier to learn. Like some languages don't have masculine and feminine. So that's going to be really hard for them to take on. But and yeah, we don't have that in English, come to think of it. We don't really
Right.
have masculine and feminine in English, but yeah, it's actually, I guess it's not that hard for us to learn. But like then there's some languages like German that also has neuter,
Right. Right. Or,
Yeah.
coming the other way, I taught English as a second language for a while, and
cool.
I taught kids who, their native languages didn't have articles. So
Right.
they were constantly leaving articles out or using the wrong ones
Right.
because they just didn't make as much sense to them.
And articles actually are really difficult to get correct. Yeah.
Yeah, they make sense to us because they've, always been there. But if you're
this is another fascinating point. If you ask somebody who's not particularly like studying language, what's the difference between a book and the book? They'll have a hard time explaining it to you. Maybe
Right.
you know immediately because you taught English as a second language, and I also, for a while, taught English as a second language, and I'm very into linguistics, so we could explain technically how those are different. But most native speakers of a language have no idea about the grammar in terms of explaining it. They just
Right.
know it intuitively.
Right. And with English is such a hodgepodge of stuff that it has just sucked up from other languages that there were moments when I would just have to look at my kids and say, because it's English, I'm sorry. I wish I had a better explanation for you.
Right.
But
Right.
this is one of those things that doesn't make much sense. And it's just the way it is. Sorry.
Right. Well, I mean, you say hodgepodge, so I don't know if this is too much about language for your podcast, but since I love languages so much, English is basically Anglo-Saxon and French smashed together because the French invaded England in 1066. And if you look at the structure of the language, you can see all of the stuff that comes from French and all of the stuff that remains from Anglo-Saxon, because all the stuff comes from French. It's like all of our like upper class words and intellectual words. Intellectual comes from French, right? And you can even see it in the food, right? Like, why do we say beef and not cow for what we eat? Because it's la boeuf from French.
Right.
But we say brot, bread. That's from the Anglo-Saxon, which of course sounds like German, right?
Yep.
So you can see how it's mashed together. Of course, there's other influences as well, but those are the two main ones.
Yeah. And then you get, random words from Irish and other stuff. And that's where it's like, this word has a strange spelling. And the only good reason that I can give you for why it's spelled this way is because somebody transliterated it that way when they came over from wherever. Yeah.
Right. Or even, it's left over from Old Norse or Old Anglo-Saxon or what have you, Of course, English spelling makes no sense. We all know that. It's just totally off the wall. It's just have to memorize it,
Yep.
Yeah.
So before we get to the book, I would love to hear a little bit about your time with music labels and working in that field.
Sure. So basically, I went to Japan, as I told you, and I taught English for a couple of years. And as we were talking about, my creative side sort of took over. I was like, all right, I want to write. So I became a journalist and a photojournalist. So I wrote on all different kinds of subjects. But what I most enjoyed writing about was music and film. And I had studied some film in university. And so those two loves in writing and also photography took me down those paths in my career. So I basically wrote about music and then got involved with creating music labels in Japan. And I can talk about them very specifically if you like. Both of them are defunct now. And the Japanese music industry is quite different than the rest of the world in many, many ways. And we can talk about it if you like. And for a while, the labels went really well. But after a certain point, it was like, okay, this isn't so profitable anymore. But I was lucky because right around the time my labels were fading, I got the opportunity to be the Billboard bureau chief / correspondent in Asia. And I did that for a long time, 13 years. And, Billboard is a recognizable name, going from running small labels. And I did report for some pretty big magazines, but I didn't have an official position. So oftentimes, like, people not returning your phone calls or whatever, to everybody always returning your phone calls. That was great. It was a real blessing, because Billboard is such an important name in the music industry.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Got me thinking about all of those Japanese 12-inch singles that I bought when I was in middle school and high school. And, you know, how different it's just such a novelty to have something that, it's like, oh, but it's the Japanese one. Like, how different was it really? I don't know, but it seemed very different at the time, for sure.
Right. Well, as is probably well known, and you probably know as well, because as we talked about earlier, they're very focused on work. They're very disciplined. They produce really, really high quality stuff. So that's why they rule the world in cameras and cars and electronics for so long. Not anymore. We could talk about that. But, pressing a record, the quality of the pressing is really important. So their pressings were really, really good. And that's why they were valued. Yeah.
I actually had no idea. I always thought that there was some different, cultural thing or that it was a different mix or something like that. But I didn't realize that it was actually the record itself. That's interesting.
Yeah.
It tells you what I didn't understand when I was that age, too.
It's possible that there was a different mix for Japan, but you're talking about American artists or British artists.
Oh, yeah. It's likely I was wrong.
Yeah, they're probably not different. Occasionally, there would be a different mix for Japan, but usually, it was just the quality of the pressing and possibly the artwork as well would be different for Japan. They're trying to appeal to the market. Yeah.
Wow.
Right. And just to add the final piece there. So I got involved in music, and I also got involved in film. So I've produced some films, and I really love filmmaking. And today it's a lot easier with video and stuff, but to make a feature film and do it properly and, promote it properly takes so much money. They're really, really big projects.
Sure.
I've done it 3 or 4 times. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
So now you've got this book.
Yes.
Of the famous Tuesdays with Morrie.
Yes. My dad, Morrie. Yes.
Yeah. So, and I was fascinated, when I first heard about it, because I remember Tuesdays with Morrie, and I read the book at the time, haven't read it since, so it's a little on the fuzzy side in my memory, but yeah, so this new book is actually kind of an old book that you've revived, and it's interesting to read it because, all of the references are from the 90s,
right?
And maybe some from the 80s. So had you expected to go and do something with this book at some point?
All right.
Previously?
So I'll tell the story so you can get the idea of the flow of it. So basically, I had traveled around Asia. We'll go way back to start at the beginning. And I came back to the United States in 1989. And that's exactly when my father was working on this book. He wrote it from like late 1988 until 1992. Most of the work in 1989, 90, 91. 92, he edited. Well, he didn't really edit, but he collated it and tried to get it published. In any case, I was traveling around. I came back. I was living at home for 3 months before I moved to Japan full time. And I talked with my father a lot about his ideas, about this book and what he was doing and what was so exciting for him. And, that was great that we got to sit around and talk. I was living at home. I wasn't working, so I had a lot of free time. And then I moved to Japan. He continued to write the book and then tried to get it published and wasn't able to, and then developed ALS, got sick, as is well described in Mitch's book, did all the stuff, all the TV, and met Mitch. Then he passed away, and Tuesdays with Morrie became this incredible phenomenon. 5 years on the bestseller list, just incredible. Number one on the bestseller list, just incredible amount of sales, 18 million copies or some absurd number, translated into 40 languages, just crazy. And I still was going back and forth between the US and Japan, visit my mother. We had a house in Newton, Massachusetts, and she kept his study just as it had been when he was alive. And I was in there, as we've discussed, I was a journalist, so I would be writing my articles. And one day I just pulled open a desk drawer. It really happened just like that. I just was like, oh, let's see what's in here. And there was this big bound manuscript with hardcover, written from the first word to the last word. Some people have incorrectly said, oh, he put this book together from his father's notes. It's like, no, this book was fully written from beginning to end. As you said, there's a lot of references from the late 80s, early 90s in there. I think actually they're still quite relevant, but we can get to that. And I remembered as soon as I looked at the manuscript, oh yeah, Dad wrote this, and I talked to him about it, and I was really excited for him at the time, but it just languished there for, how many years would that be? 12 years or something like that. And he had been gone for 7 or 8 years by the time that I found the book. And then I knew, okay, I should really do something with this. But it was a really long process to do it for a number of reasons. And of course, my mother was very heavily involved, which I can explain if you're interested. But pretty much to answer your question, once I found it again, I knew that I should do something with it, that my father would have wanted this book to be published. And now we had the opportunity because of Mitch's incredible book that touched so many people. We have so much feedback from Tuesdays with Morrie. I could tell you so many stories of meeting people and they find out who my father is and they burst into tears, So
I bet. Well, and I was, I don't remember, because it's been so long since I've read Tuesdays with Morrie, if that book mentions the books that your dad was so well known for. But when I read this one, I was like, wait, he wrote this groundbreaking book about, mental hospitals? Really? I had no idea. So it kind of surprises me that with that background, he wasn't able to get this one published when he originally wrote it. But at the same time, I'm glad that something happened that made it possible for it to come out now.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So first of all, no, Mitch doesn't mention the mental hospital or any of the 3 academic books that my father wrote. You have to remember, they're a long time before, not even Tuesdays with Morrie. They're before Mitch even met my father. The mental hospital is 1954. They published The Nurse and the Mental Patient in, I think, 56 or 57, and the next book was in the 60s. So this is even 10 years before my father met Mitch. So, but you have to remember, these were academic. They were a long time before, and they're academic works.
True.
Even if it's a watershed academic work, it's not going to sell as much as a moderately successful, paperback. Academic works just aren't that good. They exist in an entirely different world, right? So the mental hospital was this huge watershed. It was used as a textbook to train psychiatrists. It was, heralded as a major breakthrough. It's the reason that my father got his position at Brandeis University. He was made a full professor immediately with tenure. He didn't have to go through the ranks and be promoted. He just immediately, that's how much of a watershed the book was. But by the late 80s, when he started writing this book, the reason that he started writing it is that he was forced to retire. In 1986, he was forced to retire. So not only were all of his academic achievements long, long before, but he was finished or, no longer a full professor when he started writing this book. And that's a lot of what it's about. This book is saying, just because society says, okay, we're not going to let you do that job anymore, doesn't mean you have to go off and sit in a corner. This can be the most joyous, creative, fulfilling time in your life. And then my father goes on to explain why.
He does.
Okay.
And it's really, not to be totally cliched, but none of us are getting any younger.
Right.
And,
Right. Right.
and so, I'm not the age that he's talking about, but, give me 20, 25 years.
Sure. Sure.
It's not like it's as far away as it once was.
Right.
And so I'm kind of looking at it from that lens, and also, watching other people that I know who are at that point. And so it's not like reading it when you're 25.
Right.
And
Right.
it's very interesting to see how he's broken it into the different chapters. He's kind of categorized things.
Yes.
And the examples that he gives, where he's even talking about things like internalized ageism.
Absolutely.
Which I don't know how much people talk about that now, but I'm sure nobody was talking about it when he was originally writing the book.
It wasn't discussed very much. That's right. And that's why he felt it was so important to get this book out. And you've hit on it exactly. I mean, that's the beginning. That's his starting point when he was forced to retire, and he started thinking about things, and he realized that society viewed him as an elderly person. And he never viewed himself as an elderly person. Mm-hmm. And then he realized that not only did society view him as an elderly person, but society had negative connotations with that. And then not only did he realize that society had negative connotations, that he realized that he had internalized negative connotations, all these ageist, tropes. And he realized he had to get rid of those, and he had to, try and help other people expunge those, and realize it's really poisonous idea that because you're elderly, you can't do something, or you're not mentally competent, or whatever. He says that's all ridiculous. And it's very much like all of the other things that we're trying very hard at this point to get rid of from our society: sexism and racism, things that say because of some external factor of you, you're less than somebody else, which is just ridiculous. Or ableism. Any of it, right? We know that what makes people unique and special has nothing to do with that, and has everything to do with what's inside of them, their personality and their heart and their, et cetera, willpower and the rest of it. The first part of this book is discussing ageism and trying to help people get rid of that poisonous idea. He actually creates his own term, which he calls age casting, which which hasn't been adopted, but I hope it is adopted with the publication of this book, which is how elderly people are shuttled into a role. Like, now you're elderly, so you must play this role. But it's ridiculous. It's like typecasting an actor. It's like an elderly person can do anything, but we try and push them into these certain limited situations. And that's what he's fighting against. So that's the first part of the book, is this kind of a psychological insight, which of course relates to my father's background. And then the next part of the book, the longer part, of course, is about how do you fight against this? How do you live a joyous and creative life? And if you're having problems, if you're, stuck, how can you move beyond that? And he gives all kinds of techniques and ideas. And since you've read the book, examples and stories and poetry. He's really trying to inspire people.
Yeah. And there, he tells some stories that are kind of on the sad side. And I know that they're there to illustrate, like, this is sort of like what happens when somebody tells you your life is over and you believe it. And, sooner rather than later, your life kind of is over. And it's jarring. I mean, I think there was one with I think her name was Alice, the therapist, who was working into her 80s, and then suddenly someone told her she couldn't anymore. And it was just heartbreaking.
Yes.
I don't know, because obviously I'm only me. I'm only one person. My sample size is very small. but I found myself, imagining myself in those people's shoes. What would it be like if that were me? And I think that is a really powerful technique to illustrate those points, because I wouldn't want somebody saying, no, sorry, you've done this for, 60 years, but you're done now,
Right.
just arbitrarily.
Right.
And I don't know that people are so much told at this point, oh, sorry, you're a certain age, it's time for you to retire, no matter what you think about it or how useful you still are. I don't know if that still happens to the same degree, but even so, and it may happen more than I'm aware of, but regardless, we still have that societal view that's kind of like, yeah, old man, you're done, move on, get out of the way. And there is a time to kind of hand the baton on to others or to mentor them. And he does talk about mentoring others and that as not only as a way of handing on the baton, but of staying engaged in life. And I think that makes sense. It's that whole, another cliche, the circle of life, right? But that's how it goes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, there's a lot to respond to there. First of all, I think that in certain professions, the forced retirement has been faded out. Other, in corporations, obviously, it's still going to exist and they want fresh blood. And there's not a lot you can do about that. And it is very sad when, somebody is pushed out of a job that they really love, also that they probably are still really good at. But that is part of society. And I think part of what my father is saying is if you experience that, look at it as a blessing that you can now go on and do other things, right? Or even do the same thing in a different way, start your own company, and as you say, there are some sad stories like that, but there's also a lot of inspiring stories. I don't know if you got to the one of the Chinese guy who graduates university at 90.
Yes.
And plans to be a doctor,
Yes.
There's a lot of inspiring stories as well. And that's what they're there for, to say, like, you're 72 and you're feeling old. Look at this guy who's 23 years older than you, It's like there's always a possibility to move forward, even if it seems like there's obstacles in your way. And that's what my father's trying to illustrate.
And I'm not sure if it was that same guy or if it was a different story, but the one who decided to go to high school because there was so much to learn now that hadn't been available.
Yeah, that's a different guy. Yeah.
And I was just like, how many people would even think about that?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I mean, I find the stories very inspiring. And it's like, I think my father understood that different people are inspired or moved by different things. Some people are moved by stories. Some people want exact techniques. How do I, get to where I want to go? And he lays that out as well. So the book is so rich and there's so many different things. There's stories and poetry and lots of techniques and lots of analysis as well of, we could call psychological analysis. If you fall into this rut, maybe try and do this sort of thing.
Yeah. And I liked the fact that he's obviously not trying to replace, a therapist or any kind of situation like that, but he does encourage people to reflect on themselves, which I think a lot of older generation folks may not ever have been in a situation to do. There's the whole generational idea of what therapy and self-reflection is and whether or not you should do that. And I thought that was really, really interesting because, if you've never done that before, it might be kind of scary, but he gives you a little, just a kind of taste of it to get you started. If you like it, you can keep going.
Right.
If it doesn't really work for you, then, there's other stuff in the book.
Exactly. I mean, and there's a lot to say about that because, therapy or whatever you want to call it, that psychoanalysis exists in so many different social milieus. And I'm sure there's some in this country where people would still think that's weird or look down at it. I think the urban, America, it's still, not still, but now is very accepted. People go to therapists and stuff like that. And we can go back in history and look at what my father was involved in that. But, that's his field, right? Mm-hmm. Mental health is his field. So he was in what they called at that time analysis, which was therapy in the 1950s, right? When it was still extremely unusual, but that was his field. So it's not unusual that he was doing it himself. And then in the 1970s, he started a low-cost mental health collective in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to bring it to people who didn't necessarily have the financial means to get mental health help because it was extremely expensive. And in those days, and the idea of insurance covering that sort of thing was completely ridiculous. So he started this collective called Greenhouse, and they would, do all kinds of therapy and sessions. And it was totally on a sliding scale of how much you could afford to pay. And if you could afford to pay zero, that's what you paid, right? And that was really, really important to him. That was a big part of his life. So he's been involved in that, bringing that idea of helping people with their mental health throughout his whole career, and not necessarily in an academic way. I mean, maybe started out in an academic way, but certainly moved to much more popular, reaching out to general people.
What was it like for you reading this book for the first time?
Well, certainly it was very exciting. I mean, there's so many different levels to answer that question on. Intellectually, it was exciting. Emotionally, it was really powerful because you can really hear my father's voice, booming throughout these pages. And he had been gone a long time when I was reading this book. So it was very exciting, both intellectually and emotionally. Of course, I have to admit that as soon as I started reading it, I had the idea that I wanted to publish it, and that basically it was only me that could bring this project to fruition because, I had talked to him about it. I was his son. In fact, my mother told me that once we first started talking about it. She said, well, this is going to be published. It's only you who can make this happen. So because I'm a journalist and an editor, as soon as I started reading it with an editor's eye. Even the first time I was like, okay, we can cut this. This is too long. So it hit me on a lot of different levels when I started reading it.
I bet you had moments where it was like a conversation in your head.
I certainly had to consider whether my father would have objected. I mean, some of the things, since he wrote it over such a long period of time, some of the things were just repetitive. It was odd. Okay, this needs to go. But other things were more of a judgment call. And, I always wonder if my father would have said like, oh, yeah, you got something important there, but hopefully not. I don't think so,
Well, and you have a note at the end of the book about your mom was one of his editors.
Yeah, I wrote an essay.
A long time. And then she also had a hand in some of the editing.
That's right. She put me on the path. We did some of the very first edits of the book. I edited the book about 5 separate occasions. The first run through, Mom helped, and she was my father's editor. She did edit all 3 of those academic works that I mentioned in the 50s and the 60s, and a lot of his papers, which were published after that. So she was very familiar with my father's writings, its weaknesses, how to edit them. And yeah, she put me on the path initially, and then I took it from there.
Well, that sounds like a cool collaboration too.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, since you read the essay, you'll know this, but my mother was also a healthcare professional. She worked a mental health care professional. She worked in the psychiatric clinic at MIT here in Cambridge, in the Boston area, and did a lot of research as well and published a lot of papers. So she was a very serious academic in addition to seeing patients. And she worked at the psychiatric clinic at MIT when she was basically forced to retire because of age. From there, she continued a private practice until she was 91 years old. Wow. So it fits in with my father's book.
Yeah, it does.
And her own practice, meaning she rented the office, she paid all the bills, she had to do all the bookkeeping as well as treat all the patients. She ran her own business, basically.
Good for her.
Yeah, she was pretty spectacular. Yeah,
I think just based on having read your dad's book, I think he'd have been proud of her.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure. And I mean, that was something while he was alive. She was working at MIT. I mean, that was something that was taken for granted their entire marriage, that she had a career, she was highly educated. She had a PhD. It was never like she was expected to be some kind of typical housewife. That was never the marriage.
Yeah. Still good for her.
Yeah. Yeah, I have lots of stories about my mom, actually,
I bet you
which is funny because she was a very private person, and people who know Tuesdays with Morrie, the movie or the book, might notice that she's more or less absent. And that was by design. She wanted to be kept out of it. She didn't want her name to be in it. She was super happy that she took that step after it became this incredible bestseller. She didn't really want her, face to be the face of the Morrie franchise by any stretch of the imagination. So she's very much out of it. But now that she's not here, I feel that I can talk about her career and her accomplishments, and she would be happy with that.
That seems fair.
Yeah.
Credit where it's due.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, I do have a lot of stories. I'll tell you one. So my mother and father met at the University of Chicago in the 40s. And my father was getting a PhD. My mother was getting a master's at that time. And it was unusual for women to get PhDs at that time. The master's was like what women aim for. So she got this master's degree and she taught sociology and social psychology at different universities around the country at that time before she was married to my father. And she taught at Howard University, a historically Black university, which was very unusual for a white woman to be teaching at Howard in the 1950s.
I'm sure.
So he had a lot of fascinating experiences. And, it was very much her orientation to try and bring education to people.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking maybe you need to write a book about her.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I wonder if I have enough material. Maybe.
You might.
Yeah, I might. Yeah.
You might.
Yeah. I put a little of that in the essay at the end of the book. Some of it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what was it like for you when your dad kind of became a celebrity when Tuesdays with Morrie came out?
Right. Well, since I was more or less living in Japan when Tuesdays with Morrie was published, I wasn't in the eye of the storm, as it were. My mother certainly got lots of correspondence. Lots of people wrote letters and stuff. I was viewing it a little bit more from afar, though there was a Japanese version published, and I was on TV in Japan with Mitt talking about it. So, I mean, of course, in one way, it was amazing because, it always surprises people, especially people who are into the book. My father was not famous in his lifetime. He was not a public figure. I mean, he was an academic, recognized in the academic world, but as you know, that's an entirely different thing than being a celebrity to being in the public eye. And not only that, he never saw one page of Tuesdays with Morrie, right? Mitch didn't even start writing it until after my father had passed away. So he didn't know anything about the book. So it's kind of ironic that he posthumously became so famous and so beloved. I get this question a lot. He would have absolutely adored it. He was not a shy person. He would have loved the limelight and the fact that people were interested in his wisdom and what he had to say. He would have absolutely loved that. So in some ways, it was ironic, and we could call it even bittersweet that he wasn't able to experience that. But of course, it was a joy to create this legacy, well, I didn't actually create it, from Mitch's book. It was a joy to see this legacy being created. I certainly did my best to push it forward. I did some TV stuff in Japan and a few other things here and there. And then after a while, Mitch wrote a play, and the play started to be performed around the country and around the world, right? So I started to do Q&A after the play. I've done Q&A after the play all around this country, and in fact, in a lot of international territories, particularly China. The Chinese are very much into the Tuesdays with Morrie play. I could tell you how it came about, but that's not that important. What's important is there's been 250 performances, more than 250 performances, the most prestigious theaters in Beijing and Shanghai. And it's very much, success and highly beloved in China, which is fantastic, right?
Yeah. At the same time, I have to think it must have been kind of surreal too.
It certainly was surreal. Well, I'll tell you the story. Yeah, I'll tell you the story. I spent time in China in the 80s and the 90s, and I hadn't been to China for 14 years. And I went in 2012 to cover a music festival because I was writing for Billboard, as we discussed, and I was covering all of Asia. So Chinese music industry was just starting to become powerful and vibrant. And the night before I left Shanghai, I saw like a poster of Tuesdays with Morrie was going to be performed as a play in Shanghai, and my mind was entirely blown. Like, I had no information that there was even a Chinese version of the book, much less the play had been performed in Shanghai. And then I had to do a whole bunch of research to find out how was this happening. And I had to go through Mitch's agent, who talked about how they licensed the play, and it was a whole number of steps. And I found the guy who was responsible for it, and I talked to him, and that's how, in the end, I did Q&A after the play in Shanghai and Beijing many, many times. But can you imagine, in China, such a completely different culture than ours, finding a flyer of a play about your father that you had no idea existed?
It seems to me like it would be an out-of-body experience.
It was pretty crazy. Like, I literally could not believe it. I mean, of course, this is long after Tuesdays with Morrie is a huge hit in the US and translated into many, many languages. But the play being performed in China, I had no idea.
Yeah. I'm sure the Q&A must be very interesting too.
I mean, truthfully, it wasn't that different than Americans or other places that people wanted to know stories about my father. The typical questions are stories about my father and how accurate is the play in terms of his life, and what's the most moving part of the play for you. Those are pretty much the kind of questions you get. I mean, of course, there are others as well, but that sort of span different cultures,
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed.
Yeah. So there you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, since your dad is famous for his wisdom, since that's what you've called the book and that's what he's sharing in the book, I'm wondering, what wisdom have you gained from working on this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot. One, and I think that this has also come through with other projects, but particularly with this one, if you present something that's valuable or that you think is valuable, other people will get excited and people will help you. The amount of help that I've received from people who are just doing it out of the goodness of their heart is just remarkable. And it's, it's been so wonderful. So that's something that I learned by doing this project. You present something that you think is valuable and people will come to join you to do it,
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
So we should all go and think about what's valuable to us.
And pursue it. Absolutely. And pursue it, don't be shy.
All right. Words to live by right there.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, we'll put links to the Wisdom of Morrie in the show notes and all of that good stuff so that everybody can find you. And thank you so much for coming and talking with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much. As you can tell, I love talking about all these subjects from my father to language to creativity. So I really enjoyed this conversation. And I would say to your listeners, if they buy the book and they like it, if it has something valuable for them, please write a review, either if it's Amazon or Goodreads, because the reviews are really, really important. And I'd really appreciate it.
That's this week's show. Thanks so much to my guest, Rob Schwartz, and to you for listening. Please leave a review for this episode. There is a link right in your podcast app. And in it, tell us about a time when you were encouraged to challenge a stereotype. If you enjoyed our conversation, I hope you'll share it with a friend. Thanks so much. If this episode resonated with you, don't forget to get in touch on any of my social platforms or even via email at nancy@fycuriosity.com and tell me what you loved. And if you're feeling a little bit less than confident in your creative process right now, and you haven't yet signed up for my free email series on 6 of the most common creative beliefs that are messing you up, please check it out. It'll untangle those myths and help you get rolling again. You can find it at fycuriosity.com, and there's also a link right in your podcast app. See you there, and see you next week. Follow Your Curiosity is produced by me, Nancy Norbeck, with music by Joseph McDade. If you like Follow Your Curiosity, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. It really helps me reach new listeners. Thanks.